talking about carbon insetting or offsetting. It is a bit of a contentious subject around the idea of trading and good and bad. I'm going to hand straight over to Georgia and Terry and let them introduce themselves and what they're working on and give you a brief rundown on what they are talking about.
It's happened. I go first. Okay, Terry. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thrilled to be here. My name's Georgia Sheil. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Zero Net Emissions Agriculture Cooperative Research Centre, or CRC. A little bit about ourselves, just sort of brief history. Originally, I'm a civil engineer by trade, but have worked at the intersection between research development, investment in agriculture and industry for 6 or 7 years now, with a short stint within the cultured meat space, if anyone heard the talk before. And yeah, so what we've aligned on, Terry and I, is actually you introduce yourself and then we introduce the topic. What do you reckon? Yeah.
All right, Terry McCosker. I have been involved professionally in agriculture for about 56 years now. I know it doesn't look like that, and I've been involved in what is called today regenerative agriculture since the late 1980s. And out of that journey into regenerative agriculture, particularly grazing management over the last 30 odd years, going on towards 40, I realised fairly early on that after about 20 years, that our landscape was getting softer, water was going in and not running off. And I remember one day, one of our clients, we took some people from WWF out to his property. And the first place he took them to was an empty dam. And he was so proud of the fact that there was no water in that dam because he had fixed the water cycle. And what he was trying to do was actually shift their paradigm. And so what we realised is that the way that was shifting was adding carbon to soils. We were changing the sponge, we were adding carbon, adding to water holding capacity, soils were getting softer. And so I thought that it would be a good idea if farmers actually got paid for that effort. And I started that 3 years ago. Unfortunately, they're 3 dog years. So in the carbon space, it takes 7 years to make 1 year's worth of progress. So I've been in it for 3 dog years. And if I knew then what I know now, I never would have started. Quite frankly, it's the hardest, most convoluted, most difficult journey I've ever been on. And because firstly, there's so many people trying to stop you from doing it. And that really doesn't make a lot of sense. So I guess that's my background now. I'm working very significantly and for the last few years in the space of soil carbon and in creating carbon credits out of that. And we have created over 90% of Australia's carbon credits now out of soils, and that's come off 4 properties. And so we have proved at a large scale that it can be done, that it's certainly cost effective and actually highly profitable. So that's sort of a little bit of a background. So our topic is insetting versus offsetting. And this gets quite contentious depending on which way you're looking at it. So basically, an inset or an offset is a tonne of carbon dioxide. And sometimes that tonne of carbon dioxide could be an ACCU or it could be something that somebody else has invented or measured, but it's still a tonne of carbon dioxide. So essentially what an inset means is that tonne of carbon dioxide is going into your supply chain. So if you're in dairy, it goes to your dairy, your suppliers, your trucks, and right through to the supermarkets. If you're in things like beef, then it goes to the abattoirs and the other processors and the transport and the storage and the cold storage and then right through to McDonald's, etc. And so the contentious little bit is who actually pays for an inset, because it's very obvious who pays for an offset. And I'll hand over to you, I think, Georgia, and then we can get into that a little in more depth.
Beautiful. Thank you, Terry. So I like to, because I'll just build on what you started and opened with, and I like to think about it as the analogy of you could offset, i.e. you could share the abundance that you have with your neighbour, or you could inset, meaning that you hold that value within your family and you share it in the family. So when we think about insetting, it's really driven ultimately by targets around scope 3 emissions within your supply chain. That's the ultimate driver. So the 30 by 2030 emissions intensity targets, scope 3 targets that your supply chain may have set. There's almost an inherent assumption when they set that target that you would share the carbon, the slice of the carbon that you have sequestered or stored, that you would share it with them as opposed to share your abundance with a neighbour or another industry. So I guess, and I'd be interested to sort of throw this around with you, it potentially depends on your business model and your supply, who your family is, who your supply chain is, and your business model and your business plan as to whether insetting or offsetting is long-term going to be more fortuitous. Noting that very clearly, offsetting is a system that is really well defined and operational and effective. Did I say insetting? I meant offsetting. Did I say offsetting? Great. Yeah. I'm very hot. Sorry. Friends in the front row. Whereas insetting is conceptual. Like, I'm totally frank. And so some of the work of the CRC, more so for visibility, less so than spruiking, just for visibility, one of the key underpinning projects the CRC is investing in is actually looking at what the business model needs to be for insetting. So how, the counterfactual is, it's not like a zero-sums game. A ton of carbon is worth at the moment, is it still 35?
No, it's about 41 last week, but I've heard it's come back to about 38.
Yeah, 41, 30. It's got a monetary value, so it's not a zero-sums game. Someone needs to pay for it. And I guess in the model of insetting, the assumption is that you share it with your family, but what hasn't yet been figured out is how does the family, pay you for that service that you give to the family. So that's an absolute cornerstone of the CRC initial foundational investment and project that we're doing, is to bring large producers and their entire supply chain together to figure out what the business model of co-sharing would need to look like in order for insetting to actually work. So I guess the fundamental is it's conceptual at this stage.
I guess my view is, because I take the position of a primary producer when I think about these things, is that if you have been doing a carbon project, for example, and you have accus, then there is a market for those accus and there's a market price for it. It's a product that you've actually produced on your property, and therefore you have every right to sell it. If you do sell it, you're not carbon neutral. I think the thing that you have to understand is that if you sell all your carbon credits, even though you produced it, those carbon credits are not going towards your own emissions, they're going to somebody else's emissions. That's a point to understand. But I think what our data so far has shown is that emissions as a percentage of total sequestration is 6%, right? 6%. So across 4 properties now, the total sequestration is 500,000 tonnes. They only get, at this stage, 250,000 accus out of that. So half the sequestration on those properties is not saleable as accus at the first round. So that, what's left, to me, I call it a measured, non-credited abatement. In other words, it's actually been measured to exactly the same standard as an accu, but we cannot convert all that extra stuff into accus. Now, in the first round of a soil carbon or a vegetation project, 25% of your credits are not for sale. So out of that 500,000 tonnes, there's 25% that you're not allowed to sell, and there's another 25% that you're never allowed to sell. So I'll try and explain that a bit better. 25% you get back next time you measure your carbon, provided you've gone forwards. So at the end of the day, if you're continuing to go forward in your sequestration, then your net loss or carbon that you cannot sell is about 25%. So when you've got 25% of non-credited measured abatement, and you've got only 6% of your total is emissions, right? Then you've actually got a measured amount of carbon that can potentially be used as an inset. So you actually have some up your sleeve. Now, you wouldn't get rid of all of that because 5% is put aside by the federal government as a risk of reversal. So that means if your projects fail, the federal government's got some stuff up their sleeve to make up for it. So it gets a little bit complex, but and I must say that data comes from central Queensland through to northern New South Wales, and the same ratios will not apply as you move further south. And the reason is that sequestration is per hectare and emissions are per head. So when we carry, say a beast to 3 hectares, then we've got 3 hectares of sequestration to 1 beast's worth of emissions. If you come down here and you're running 2 animals to the hectare, I'm talking cattle, for example, then you've got 2 animals worth of emissions and 1 hectare's worth of sequestration. So that equation doesn't always hold. I've got plenty more to say on that, but I'll hand over to...
Well, the benefit of insetting being conceptual is I've kind of introduced the concept now. So, and I'll be honest, I'm sitting in the presence of greatness. You have extreme and deep knowledge in this space, and I'll be honest, I'm sort of beginning my journey, but I don't have a lot more to say about insetting purely because, led by industry, I'm really interested in the discovery work about what has to be true for insetting to work and in what contexts, because it won't work in every context. As I said before, it really depends on your business model and who your family is, because insetting is purely driven, not purely, but fundamentally, as the moment that your supply chain sets a target, their assumption is that you're going to share your carbon with them. Otherwise, you're not necessarily going to be as preferred as another supplier to them because they've got targets that they need to then meet and report on. Now, it depends on who your supply chain is, if it's mandatory versus voluntary and all of those things. So I think, though, introducing and offsetting being something that's a direct, immediate value that you can derive, you've just got to decide for you and for your farm and your production system what is going to be the most valuable, strategy for you in the short term, but also the long term, knowing that this is these targets are very much inbound. We've got 2030 targets, we have 2050 targets. So it's very much part of the future and a dimension you should consider. But other than that, we could even turn to questions.
I'll just make a comment on regeneration versus industrial agriculture. And I'll give you some figures on grain. For example, in West Australia, conventional grain has emissions of around about 1,100 kilograms of CO2 per tonne of grain. Regeneratively grown grain in the same environment has 300 kilograms of emissions per tonne of grain. So to me, the first thing that a farmer needs to look at doing to reduce your scope 3 emissions for the people you're supplying is look at what you're doing. And if there's stuff that you can do to be reducing your own emissions, then your product, like that 300 kilo per tonne emissions in WA, that product is a premium product and is always in demand, or that demand is increasing for that product. And so I think that's where we need to look first, is what do we need to do? And we know in grazing, for example, if you're doing a good time control grazing system, your emissions are down by about 22% just because of the grazing system that you're using. And one of the problems with the whole methane thing is that if you are doing that, you don't actually get the benefit of it because it's not measured on farm. You're using generic equations. And that to me is a real problem, because if I'm doing my share and let's say I'm growing 300 kilo per tonne grain, and over here, Georgie, for example, is growing 1,000 kilos per tonne of grain, and that's not being measured on farm, I'm actually being penalised because my emissions are counted, sort of calculated on the same basis as Georgie. So because generally in livestock, your biggest emission is methane emissions, and I'd love to get into that subject, but so questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for that explanation. Can I just ask a quick one? How are you measuring that? How are you measuring the carbon, if that's not too basic a question? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some really good technology that we've developed in conjunction with CSIRO over the last sort of 15 years. We now are able to measure carbon very accurately in soil. So, for example, if these hills here have got carbon in them at, say, 70 tonnes of carbon per hectare, down to a metre, we can measure that now plus or minus somewhere between 1 and 2 tonnes. And we can do that at scale. So we can do that on a 50,000 hectare property or a 500 hectare property. And so that accuracy now is meaning that the changes, because you're making small changes to organic carbon, quite small. So to put that in context, a kilo of a hectare of soil down to a metre is generally going to weigh somewhere around 12,000 to 15,000 tonnes, right? So that's a big pool of soil. There might be 70 tonnes of organic carbon in that 15,000 tonnes of pool. So firstly, we've got to find accurately that 70 tonnes of organic carbon. Then, over a 5-year period, you might add somewhere between 5 and 10 tonnes of organic carbon to that hectare. We've now got to be able to find that additional 5 to 10 tonnes of organic carbon within that 15,000 tonne pool of soil. We now have the technology and the mathematics and the systems to actually be able to do that very accurately, and that's actually been proven now over, we've now done over 200,000 hectares. So our data on accuracy now is coming from that sort of scale, not plot size stuff. Yeah. It's available, but generally under about 500 hectares, it's not viable until the price of carbon goes up even higher than it is now. So if you've got a high sequestration rate, let's say your sequestration rate is 3 or 4 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, and the price of carbon is $50 a tonne, then it's probably going to be viable down to 250, 300 hectares. Still doesn't get you down to 50 acres. And the problem is the cost, and it's the compliance cost. The costs of running these projects are very high, and it's not due to what people are making out of it, it's actually due to the compliance costs. Like an audit, we've just been through an audit. We've paid the auditors $45,000, and it's cost us in our own staff another $40,000 to do those audits. So unless you've got scale, that you can't put that over 50 acres. And that's just one of the compliance costs that we've got.
I'm sorry, I know this is breaking the rules, but given that, then how do you think about the productivity gains as well? Because all of the net benefits potentially, are actually combined maybe larger than the whole in themselves. So I think that aspect of the conversation is often overlooked, and is actually integral in the way that we talk about offsetting, insetting, and all these things. Is actually you changing practices and often moving towards best practice in many ways and improving productivity in other things. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
We look at it as two enterprises or two businesses that you have. So you have your normal production business, whether that's grazing or grain or whatever it is you're doing, and you invest in changing practices within that enterprise. That change in practice within that enterprise has got to be paid for by that enterprise. Right? Now in grazing, we generally average about a 30 to 35% return on fencing and water to set up a new grazing practice. So, and that's a pretty good return. Now, if we then separate out the carbon project's got its own cost. So a 2,000 hectare property is probably going to cost $100,000 to baseline it. And then you spend another $100,000 to do the next measurement. Then you add the $40,000, and then you add a whole lot of other costs that are actually involved in doing it. And so there's quite a lot of money out before you see anything come back. The return that we've had on that is we've got 3 properties and they're all over 2,000 hectares each. Their annualised return at a carbon price of $45 a tonne is 65% per annum return on doing the carbon project. So if you're doing a practice change that's giving you a 30-odd% return over there on your land business and your production business, and then you've got costs associated with a carbon project, and that's giving you, on that scale, a 60% return at that $45 a tonne price. The worst one we've had is a 500 hectare project, and their return was 25% on the carbon project, 25% per annum. And that's over a 5-year period. What we have found in the livestock game, because when we started this we could only ever do it in grazing, the return from a carbon project on the ones that are real and they've got credits is about, when I look at it on an actual EBIT, net profit per hectare per annum, the carbon income is between 3 and 5 times the EBIT from livestock production on the farm. So, and that's offsetting. So that is selling all of those credits. And the other huge advantage that we're seeing now is that our farmers now can forward contract. So they can say, well, I'll supply into a contract 10,000 tonnes of CO2 a year. Now, there's no risk to them or the supplier because they've got 60, 70,000 tonnes or ACCUs sitting in their account. So now they forward sell 10,000 tonnes a year. That's guaranteeing them at today's price $400,000 a year income, risk-free, done, right? The product's already in the bank, if you like, and the price is fixed. So if you start adding that into farming enterprises, what can that do to agriculture? It's a game changer, a massive game changer, where you can do carbon projects. Now you can't do it everywhere. Scale's a limitation. Low rainfall is a limitation. Some soil types are a limitation. But I'll tell you what the biggest limitation is. It's between these two flappy bits, right? It's management, because carbon won't create itself. It has to be created by management.
Thanks a lot, Terry, and thank you for being so honest with the figures, because I think they're really relevant in this context for sure. Question?
I've got a management question.
Georgia, do you want to just come up and challenge the phone? No, but you're in the front row.
Well, something that people always say to me is that these new markets have the potential to reward those that aren't necessarily farming well now, and they will see the carbon improve over 5, 10, 15, 25-year time frame versus someone that's been regenerating their landscapes for 45 years and don't necessarily won't be able to have as much of a carbon or biodiversity gain as rapidly as some others. And they compare that to what happened in the US when all of a sudden farmers were going to be paid subsidies to what once was good farming land. They decided to rip all out and plant soy and corn. Do you foresee that as a potential challenge that we need to be aware of if they see it as an opportunity that's worth exploring rather than a better opportunity that's worth exploring rather than actually just farming better, full stop?
Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Well, I'll go because it will be relatively quick and then Terry can go into the detail. On the insetting front, I suppose not, and you'll start the offsetting front. I guess the promise is that if your emissions factor number is really low and your supply chain is one that is assuming that you'll share that value with them, then you will inherently be a preferred supplier to them. Because if you have a low emissions factor, so if you've got really good practices, maybe you might not be, and you can help me out here, be appropriate for to make it profitable to have a carbon project, perhaps because of the way that method and mechanism is set up. You can say more. But perhaps if you're in a system where your family would benefit from that, then having a low emissions factor number is going to be of real value to them because it helps them meet their targets as well. Is the promise, if we can prove it.
Yeah, I agree. The risk is greenwashing. And is that claim of a tonne of CO2 actually real if it's not measured under the same standards that an ACCU is measured under? That's, to me, the first issue. But from my knowledge, most of the practices that you're likely to introduce in regen ag are going to lower your emissions. And I totally agree with what Georgie's saying, is that if you have lower emissions intensity, if there's a oversupply of a commodity, then your stuff's going to get bought first. If there's an undersupply, it's going to make no difference because they're going to want whatever's out there. But what some of these people in the supply chains have said to me, and pretty well everyone I've spoken to, is that there's not going to be a premium if you're carbon negative or carbon neutral. Now, the producers we've worked with are carbon negative. They've actually sequestered between 11 tonnes of carbon dioxide and 35 tonnes of carbon dioxide for every tonne of animal that they've carried, right? And that's after accounting for emissions. That's the power that's within agriculture that is not generally recognised, I don't think, because those numbers are very new and they're not out there really. So that's hot off the press for you guys. You're very privileged. But so practice change is absolutely critical. I think I agree with Georgie though. A lot of the practice changes you make will lower your emissions intensity and you're going to be fine. What was the other part of your question? You had another bit. There was a twist in that question.
Just the danger of seeing what happened in the US happen here with that and people reversing their
The question was, can people reverse their practices, pull the carbon out of the soil and then go and get credits for it? And the answer is no. Firstly, when we go and do, say, a carbon baseline, we also do an emissions baseline, which is 5 years ago. So if you did that, it would be picked up in your emissions over the over that 5 year period. But the issue is that you're not going to get soil carbon out of your soil in under 30 or 40 or 50 years. So the other thing is that the other part of your question was, what about people who've actually been doing the right thing for a long time? It comes down to what I call the size of your bucket. Now, the size of your bucket is the depth of your soil, the clay content of that soil, which is how much carbon you can store, the rainfall that you get, and the temperature, which determines the amount of oxidation that you get, and the management. I would suspect that most buckets in Australia have got a lot to go, right? If you just look at historically what was in some of our soils in percent organic carbon and where they are now, so, soils in this part of the world were probably sitting on 12 to 15% organic carbon originally, and now they might be back at 4 or 5 or 6%. And somebody look at that and say, 4 or 5, 6%, no, you've got no room to move. In fact, you've got to double it. And if you double that over a metre of soil, that's an enormous amount of carbon. And the other thing is, on soils, is that you never stop sequestering carbon. There is no limit to how much carbon you can put into a soil. And the reason is that when your soil is full, you just build soil. Right? And that's how a lot of the best soils in the world were built. It was built with livestock, grazing grasses, and soil just built and built and built. And now some of it's 30 and 40 feet deep.
Thanks, Terry. A question up the back? Brilliant. Tick that box. Next in the front. Do you want to step up?
Sure.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Terry. quickly, can you talk about the depth or the percentage of that carbon that's been sequestered across those projects below 30 centimetres? Matt Harrison was one of the opening speakers of this conference yesterday morning and talked about, he mentioned a paper that he's just put out, and he wasn't willing to speak about much below 30 centimetres, but can you just talk about how much has been sequestered below that depth, and also what you think it's going to take to get the science community to accept some of this information and knowledge?
Big question.
Yeah. And I can say that at the moment they don't. I'll do the sequestration below 30 centimetres first. Across the board, 44% of all the ACCUs issued so far have come from below 30 centimetres. Now that has varied between the properties. The highest one was 69% of their ACCUs have come from below 30 centimetres. Now that property is a lot of black cracking clays. We went through the 18-19 drought through this sequestration period. They also had pasture dieback, so the land was bare. It cracked open and it lost a heap of carbon out of the top 30 centimetres. But there's enough sequestered deeper that they still have the highest number of ACCUs issued in Australia to date. 95,000 ACCUs issued. So the lowest one was the shallowest soil, which makes sense. So it's a gravelly soil. We can only get down to between 50 and 60 centimetres, and only 25% of his credits come from below 30 centimetres. So it will vary depending on soil type and what happens to that soil. You know, things like droughts, floods, they're going to stop sequestration. And I think when you get those events, this is where management becomes absolutely critical. What all these managers did was maintain ground cover to the best of their ability. And I was asked the other night, how much did they destock? One of them was 100% destock for a year. And then he was burnt out in the 2019 bushfires because he left ground cover. One of them has had 2 floods, and he was probably 70 to 80% destock. One of the others was virtually 100%, but it went from sort of 2,000 back to something like 60 or 70 head. So a massive destock. So the reason that they ended up getting credits is they actually looked after that land through the worst drought we've had in 100 years. Now, if you get out there and you just flog it, you've got more opportunity. If you've got no ground cover, you've got more opportunity to lose that carbon from the soil. The other part was, oh God, that's a $64,000 question. The problem we have is that soil scientists generally are old, and their perception of sequestration of carbon is that it comes from biomass. And all their modelling is based on biomass. It doesn't come from biomass. It actually comes from root exudates. And we've got some data from the US showing that root exudates put 5 times more carbon into the soil than the roots themselves, right? And so this is where the science now is way behind practice. Secondly, they don't have the measurement technology that we have today and the ability to measure stuff accurately. So they think that it can't be measured. But that's probably the biggest blockage, is that their science is behind. They take no account of biology, right? And there's nobody in this room that would think that that's sensible. But yeah, and it's biology that sequesters carbon, not plants, right? So if you don't have the biology, and particularly the fungi, then you won't sequester the carbon. So I've analysed a lot of soils, and the biggest issue we have in conventional agriculture is bacterially dominated soils. And if they stay bacterially dominated because of the practices that we have, then we won't sequester the carbon. We must increase the fungal population, and that takes management.
Yeah, I think if anyone needed another reason to keep your soil covered and look after your soil biology, you just heard it. Front row, you can come up too. Sorry.
Do you want to come share? George, a question for you with the CRC. What's the primary behaviour you're going to try and drive in the first instance? Because we've heard that there's a sort of general measurement approach or a standard measurement for the different types of farming and the emissions associated. But then we also know that there's this behaviour around offsetting or the generation of credits. And then there's this sort of tertiary behaviour around actually doing the right thing for the right reasons, recognising that not everyone has access to credits. So which behaviour are we going to drive? And if it's just the accounting thing, is it just an accounting behaviour? What's the kind of outcome net?
Yeah, thanks. She's a friend of mine. She was a friend of mine. Okay. I think all of the I think the behaviour ultimately, I'll talk about insetting, that is trying to be driven is the accountability of the co-sharing, co-benefit, and then cost sharing of these practices ultimately. You know, in one model we have, if you follow these practices within this rigour and method, then you'll be recognised through anywhere from $38 to $41 a tonne. We want the same behaviours by way of, we want the same outcomes on farm, the best practice, etc. But with insetting, there is currently no behaviour for the supply chain to take responsibility for that, for those practices to be changed. So I suppose in the investments that the CRC will make in this particular work, it's going to start with the fundamental policy drivers. So that's one of the key outcomes of the initial investment, is to get essentially a roundtable together of all the supply chain partners and to understand what must be true for each of them in order to co-invest in the outcome. And then that will be pulled together into a policy recommendation. But ultimately what we're then hoping to bring into play is actually some different financial vehicles and mechanisms to make it possible. So that's sort of phase two. The initial phase is really just for the first time bringing the key players together around the table to discuss what it has to look like and then formulate that into a recommendation, and then we'll take next steps from there. We'll learn from that initial process. So fundamentally the behaviours, we're trying to drive the same behaviour. It's like, how do you incentivise a group of supply chain players that ultimately want that outcome but that haven't yet come to the table about how they might pay for it? Sorry. Yeah.
I think economics drives change, and that's the thing that I struggle with insetting. Now, if you've got accus, it doesn't mean to say you have to sell them. If you want to sell them at a lower price back into the supply chain, then you're quite entitled to, or give them to your supply chain. And there are people that are going to do that, right, because of the moral stand that they take. So, an accu doesn't have to be sold as an offset. It can be used as an inset. But I think it's economics, and this is, I guess, the problem that we've got. As Georgie said early on, there's no model at the moment for insetting. So we don't know what the economic driver of insetting is. And I don't think it's going to be price for commodity, because that could be a driver, but basically the supply chains are saying, no, we're not going to reward you for lowering your carbon emissions. You just should do that because you're good, right? And so we should, like, everybody should be lowering their emissions. So don't get me wrong. I think we should all be doing that. So there's a planetary incentive that we all have, I think, to lower our emissions, and that applies to everybody. Turn your aircon off, turn your lights off, etc., etc., etc. So we all have that obligation to help the planet. But because we actually don't have a system for valuing inputs, then insets rather, then we don't know how that's economically going to drive change. And as you pointed out, as Georgie pointed out, there's going to be quite a lot of places where you cannot do a carbon project because it's not appropriate. So you've got to rely on the practice change to lower your emissions. So the practice change is still important.
I think someone at the back.
I was just wanted some more clarification around insetting and the details around it. So when you're talking about insetting in a supply chain, as the farmer, am I responsible for, I'm sending 40 cows to JBS? Am I insetting for their emissions, or like the truck, or are they going to pass down a bit more to me to inset for them? And similarly, you keep talking about family as well. As my sister lives in Sydney or something. Am I insetting her car, or like what are you talking about there?
Yeah. Okay, so a more in-depth explanation of how insetting would work in a practical sense with supply chains, and when you talk about families who might not be involved in the farm. Are we insetting with accus? Like, how do we? What is an acu? Maybe is a good one too. Yeah.
Ollie. Yeah, you got the acu bit. I'll let Terry explain what acu is, because I'll stuff it up.
An acu is a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent created under a methodology approved by the government. And the methodology is a recipe. In soil carbon, it's a 300 or 400 page document with 40 or 50 pages of equations in it. So that's a method. And the acu has to be created under those standards to be called an acu.
Yeah, so this is a great example of where my analogy has been a little bit confusing. So it needs some work. It's the first time I've road tested it. Okay, try again. So really good questions. Fundamentally, all the questions you're asking are actually part of the research questions fundamental to the project investment, because your point exactly. We don't know the answer to those questions. It's conceptual, but it's implied by, say, JBS, for example, will have somewhere roughly in the order of a 30% by 2030 type target, or thereabouts, or slightly less, depending on who they then sell on to. Let's call it one of the major four, will have their own targets as well. What's implied in those targets is, because they're scope 3 emissions intensity based targets, is that they will be able to demonstrate emissions reduction in their supply chain, which inherently is saying my expectation is that you'll basically share that with the supply chain. Now, that's the co-sharing assumption that's inherent within those targets. How that is then paid for, how that goes then down the chain, and how that's paid for such that you are rewarded for those practices. Because to Terry's point, I think some of the dialogue to date has been, oh no, there's just an expectation that you are adopting best practice so that we can meet our targets. I haven't seen that to be true, at least in the partners that we have had discussions with to date. There's a real interest and drive for this investment so that everyone can get around the table in a way that is, Chatham House. We're going to share our numbers. We're going to have an honest conversation about what we all want to try and achieve and how we could cost share this together. I'm hopeful and I'm really curious to see what comes from that discussion, but it's a discussion that hasn't yet been had. So a lot of the questions that you've asked, I'm hoping in a couple of years' time I can answer that, but I can't right now.
The lady up the back, I think you've had your hand up for a while. Yeah.
Terry, a couple of questions. The first one is the 25% in the first auditing period that's retained by the regulator. What happens to that? And the second one is, how do you feel about the carbon market way into the future? I mean, it's controlled by government. Historically, investing for people in private enterprise, investing in government initiatives is not always a confidence builder for us. Have you got any feedback on that? Thoughts on that?
So just to bring that back, the 25% that you were talking about earlier, and how are we going to engage with the government, or how are we going to trust? Okay, what does the government do with that 25%?
The answer is nothing. They're not credited, so they're just left out of the system. And when you come back again in, say, a few years' time and remeasure, and if you exceeded what you did last time, you've added again. Yeah, so basically nothing happens to it. It's not counted anywhere. And if you come back next time and you've exceeded what you did last time, then you pick up that 25% and it's added to what you've sequestered this time. So you get it back, but it's held off. And there's some good reasons for that, and I don't mind that 25% kept back. I actually think it's good because it gives everyone some confidence that you've got something up your sleeve if something goes wrong in the next measurement period. And I think, you know, all the people that we're working with are quite happy with that. But it used to be 50%, and that was just too much. It meant that you had to go too long before you actually got a return on it, and that was a showstopper. So the question before about the scientists want to bring 50% back. 50% back will actually just stop what's happening. And I think the question for me and the scientists is, do you want carbon pulled out of the atmosphere, or do you want rules? And one of the rules to me that makes this stuff not work well in agriculture is the additionality rule. It doesn't work in agriculture. And there's so many little nuances and bureaucratic things in there that do not work for agriculture, because our carbon accounting systems based on power stations and engineering approaches to it. In agriculture, we're in the carbon cycle. We're not a straight emitter. We are cyclers. And the methods that we have don't handle that well, and they don't, like as all you'll know, in agriculture, you have to be flexible. You have to be able to change what you're doing on a dime. And the system that we're locked into at the moment it's not a straitjacket. You've still got a lot of flexibility and the ability to move around, but it's not as flexible as it should be to support agriculture. There was the second part to that.
Is the global industry of carbon bigger than the Australian government's control of us with the ACCUs?
Yeah, what about the global economy in carbon trading? How do we fit into that?
How secure, is it all going to fall over in 10 or 20 years?
How secure is it? How long is it going to last for? Will it still be here in 10 years' time?
I think if you get 10 or 20 years out of it, you'll have still done very well financially. But my view about this, and particularly soil carbon, because that's basically what I work in, is that you should be making practice changes and doing stuff for the environment in the first place. Whether you get credits out of it or not should be the reason you do it. Then, if you're sequestering carbon and you do a project, it's a bonus to what you're doing for the land in the first place. So then if the carbon credit scheme blows up in 20 years' time, it doesn't matter because you've actually got improved productivity. And one of the places that productivity is coming from is water. One of the properties, I can just remember the numbers, so they sequestered 32,000 tonnes of organic carbon over a 5-year period. That means they have sequestered 200,000 tonnes of water holding capacity on that property, right? And in the next 5 years, they'll add another 200,000 tonnes of water holding capacity to that property. In 20 years' time, are you worried about carbon credits? No, because you've actually changed your ecosystem. But it's there now, and there's very good money in it. At even $40 a tonne, it's very significant income. And so I'd be encouraging people, get into it for the practice change first and foremost. Get a bonus out of it while you can, and if it disappears, so what? Globally, it's not likely to disappear in the short term. And the carbon farming initiative, which is legislation, has been bipartisan in Australia right from the beginning.
Thank you so much, Terry and Georgia. I feel like we could probably ask you about 100 questions, each person in the audience, but I'd like you all to join with me in thanking Terry and Georgia very much.